you, listening to this podcast. I know you've worked somewhere before, and that means you've probably got at least one scary experience from that job. So send that scary work story to me at darkstories.org so I can narrate it in a future episode. Oh, and go get some EerieCast merch at eeriecast.store while you're at it. Thank you.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
On days off from Dead and Roasted, I usually just get cooped up in my room at home, playing competitive online games that make me want to yell at the neighbor's cat. So relaxing. But one of these days I'd like to go camping at the nearest national forest. Then again, a recent set of stories I was told by someone who used to work at Yellowstone has me rethinking not only the camping idea, but also my entire life. Prepare for a scare because I'm about to share some new and very creepy, allegedly true work stories with you. Let me know which you found to be the creepiest. These are tales from the break room. The unexplainable things I experienced at Yellowstone National Park. From ExParker. I don't want these experiences I'm about to share with you to scare you from visiting your favorite national forests. Go out into nature, enjoy yourselves. It's healthy for you and your children. Simply take this recollection as a warning. Things happen out in the woods, things you can't always explain or be ready for. I worked for Yellowstone National Park in the 90s for a few years before moving to the Ozarks and working as a game warden. As a Yellowstone Park ranger, my tasks were varied. There were times I would act as a tour guide, or at the very least a guest to tourist groups. I would explain facts about the forests, the animals and plants that prosper there, and Yellowstone's history. These were infrequent occasions, however. Usually I would be checking in on campers, hikers, and such, responding to reports of troublesome guests, poaching, littered or even abandoned campsites, campfires left burning, etc. Sometimes I would be tasked with recording data on animal populations, especially when one group became a bit too populated, which can endanger surrounding ecosystems. You probably wouldn't think it, but if deer, for example, become too numerous, they can destroy the environment, driving out populations of prey, which can drive out populations of predators. It was rare that I had to take part in search and rescue, but it did happen. People get lost in national forests. Yellowstone is certainly no stranger to missing persons. Usually these folks are found an hour or two after losing their way or stumbling off the path, unable to find their way back. This brings me to my first strange experience. Early one summer, a middle-aged male hiker was reported missing from his group. I was called to take part in the search and rescue operation. On an ATV, I double-checked and triple-checked the path he was last seen at. When that was fruitless, I got off the ATV and began to trek into the woods. Now, inexperienced people who become lost usually behave in similar ways. The force of gravity tends to make people want to walk downward, downhill, and people tend to find and stay for some time in open areas. So I began to walk downhill, keeping an eye out for openings in the trees, groves and such, and especially keeping an ear out for water sources. People are also drawn toward water. Who knew? Sarcasm aside, I continued walking, keeping an eye on my handheld GPS. This thing would keep me from getting lost, unless the batteries went out, or if it got too dark to read, because back then the screen didn't have a light behind it. I walked through ever-thickening brush for about 20 minutes, until it became too thick for me to travel through. No problem there. If it was too much for me to travel through, it'd be too much for the hiker too. I began to walk alongside the brush. Every so often, I would call out, "Forest Service! Anybody out here?" The sun was beginning to set by then, so I wanted to start making my way back to the path. I would get on the ATV and join back up with the main group of search and rescue. I let them know my plan via walkie-talkie, but when they replied, they told me, "Come back in, Parker. Missing hiker was recovered about 10 minutes ago." Great, I thought. They could have told me when they found him. To be honest, the team was usually good about that kind of information and updates. If anything, this was just a rare miss from them. With a sigh, I began to walk back uphill. But I twisted my ankle at some point and landed myself right in the brush next to me. As I began to pick myself up, untangling my body from the brush, I started to hear footsteps. They were coming from right in front of me. Right away, I thought it was deer, so I didn't call out or anything of the sort. I just continued to pick myself up, knowing that when they heard me rustling about, these deer would just go the other way. However, the footsteps continued to approach me. They were heavy, deliberate, and steady. As these sounds continued, I began to feel a bit worried. When I worked for Yellowstone, the wolf population was extremely low, but it wasn't non-existent. However, they shouldn't be in this area of the park. Nonetheless, I was a little bit anxious. There were few things out there heavy enough to make that kind of footstep. Was it a person? A bear? A moose? All of which would be bad news for me. I called out then. If it was a person, they would respond or come towards me. If it was an animal, they would likely be scared away. Forest Service? Anyone there? As I listened, there was not even a break in the footsteps. They continued inching closer to me, heavy and slow, just as before. I began to wonder, now why wouldn't a person call back? I started to think maybe it was someone up to no good, or someone who was simply minding their own business. I yanked my left arm, which was still stuck in the brush. My sleeve was caught on a thick bramble. It was tough to pull it out, as I was trying my best not to rip my uniform. But the closer the footsteps got to me, the more hurried I felt. As they drew nearer, these steps sounded human, or at least bipedal. My back was turned toward the noises now, as I focused my attention on getting my arm out of the bramble. The steps got closer and closer, until I swear they were right behind me. And at that point, I said screw it, and I yanked with all the force I had. A huge rip tore through my sleeve, and the skin underneath was ripped up a bit, causing me to bleed. But I was freed. I turned around instantly after that, ignoring my stinging injury. As I turned, no one was there. It was the most bizarre sensation I felt then, like I was not alone. It felt as if I was staring right into the face of a stranger. And yet, all I saw around me was darkening forest at sundown. Perhaps it was instinctual, but every fiber of my being told me not to move. So I stayed put, staring into the same direction, breathing so quietly that even I couldn't hear it. I swear I must have stayed that way for about 10 minutes straight, until suddenly I heard footsteps right in front of me, walking away. I kid you not, these footsteps sounded inches away from me, as if someone had actually been standing face to face with me the entire time, someone that I couldn't see. Through the fear and panic I felt, I suddenly had the idea to look at the ground. Footsteps would mean disturbing the ground, so I scanned the forest floor, looking for disturbances as this entity walked. But the most I saw, and I swear I saw this, was the small and thin branch of a young tree being moved out of the way by a force that could not be seen by the human eye. I stayed frozen. My mind was so far beyond boggled, I didn't even know what to think or do. What in the world had walked up to me? Why couldn't I see it? And what did it want? Why did my body scream at me not to move? What was going to happen to me if I had? I stayed there until I could no longer hear those footsteps. The moment I could no longer hear them, I ran so fast uphill, ignoring my wound on my arm and my twisted ankle. I came out about 40 yards away from the ATV, so I ran up the trail back to it. I hopped on and floored it down the trail. If my boss had seen how fast I was going, I probably would have gotten written up or fired. Hikers were frequent on these trails. The speed I was going, I could have hurt someone or worse. But at the time, I was so terrified and confused, I didn't even think about it. This was the kind of experience that sticks with you, but you're sort of afraid to talk about it for a while. I remember I tested the waters with my coworkers. On lunch breaks or after hours, I would often ask them vague-ish questions about things they've seen in the forest. Like, what's the weirdest experience you've ever had out in Yellowstone? Or, have you ever heard strange footsteps out there? But for the rest of my time working there, I never did tell the story like I am here to my coworkers. Now on to the second experience. During spring one year, we were under a very high fire danger warning. Everybody was alert about possible fire hazards. The last thing we'd want was a ravaging forest fire burning through Yellowstone. I remember getting a call one day. There was a report of smoke coming from an area where campfires were prohibited. I immediately began to make my way to the campsite. At Yellowstone National Park, at least back when I worked there, campfires were only allowed in designated camping grounds and only within the fire rings that are installed there. And you can't walk away from a campfire. It must be attended at all times. I've had to talk with campers a lot about this. People really enjoyed making campfires when and where they weren't supposed to. And more campers than I'd like to admit would leave the campgrounds with their fire still going or hot. Remember everyone, if you've got a campfire, put it out before you go and make sure it's cold to the touch. Anyway, before long I was at this campsite. It was nowhere near a proper campgrounds. It was a makeshift campsite, apparently from someone who thought they were going to rough it out in the woods. Or it could have been someone who was homeless, a drifter or some such. Both of these were not uncommon. The campsite was made up of a tattered tarp, which was tied using string to a couple of tree branches, creating a rough shelter. Next to it was an old pair of shoes. One of the shoes had a hole at the toe. Definitely not the type of shoe you'd want to walk around with out here in the woods. 5 soaking wet black socks were hung over another tree branch nearby. And around the perimeter, I saw footprints, shoeless, sockless footprints. They led out and away from the campsite. This was bizarre. You really don't want to be walking around Yellowstone without shoes or boots. But the footprints appeared to lead away, and I did not see any footprints coming back towards the campsite. Not barefoot ones, anyway. My assumption was I'd happened upon their campsite while they were temporarily gone. Using a water bottle, I threw some water on the still burning embers of the campfire, and using a stick, I stirred it about, mixing dirt and ash and water together. I gave it a poke, and it was cold. Then I leaned next to a nearby tree, waiting for my host to come back. He was going to get a verbal warning, and if he wasn't cooperative, he would be fined. After a few minutes passed by, no one came back to the campsite, so I began to walk around, seeing if I could see or hear someone nearby. But I couldn't. I had no idea where they'd gone. I figured they wouldn't have gone far without shoes or socks. As I circled back to the makeshift campsite, I hit my head on something. I looked up. It was a weird wooden ornament tied to a low-hanging tree branch. In fact, as I looked around, there were more of the same kind of ornament hanging around, all tied to tree branches. These ornaments were made of wood, woven together into a spherical form, and through the many small gaps in the wood, I could see that there was something inside. When I shook it, there was definitely something in it. I reached for a different one nearby without pulling it off the tree. I shook it too. And again, something rattled inside. Curious, I began to pry back the woven ornament until I could see what was inside. A strange smell hit me as I did, a smell like gangrene and rot. Now, it took me some time to understand what I was looking at inside this little ornament. There was just one object. It was small and about the size of my thumb. It was sort of gray and brown, with fibrous little dark brown pieces at the end. It was rounded at the other end. Then I realized it was a toenail. A toenail completely ripped off the big toe and placed inside this ornament. I dropped it then, bile rising in my throat as I wanted to gag. I looked around at all these different ornaments. I remember thinking, no freaking way. Did each one really contain a ripped off and decaying toenail? What kind of person would do this? And why were they decorating the trees around here? Right away, I got on my walkie-talkie and reported it. I went back to the trail, waiting for one of the other park rangers who said they would show up. They were supposed to be bringing a camera. Unfortunately, it took them about an hour to get there. By the time they arrived and we went back to the makeshift campsite, everything was in place, except, of course, for the toenail ornaments. As I looked at the forest floor, there was now at least 100 bare footprints that matched the ones before, now circling the campsite. Whoever had been camping here had come back the moment I was gone, and they took their disgusting decorations with them. What really creeped me out was the timing, because if they came back just as I left, that means they'd probably been watching me the entire time I was in their camp, and I hadn't seen nor heard them. This was yet another experience I didn't share with my coworkers. After all, the guy came back and got all the disgusting evidence I would have showed them. Now for my final unexplainable encounter out in Yellowstone. This one was really worrisome for me, because it actually directly affected me. The previous two experiences I shared with you were really just me seeing and hearing some weird crap. But this time around, something happened to me. On this occasion, I had the week off, and I spent part of it as a hiker at Yellowstone. Being employed there, I pretty much knew the place like the back of my hand. I wanted to enjoy my favorite spots, the most beautiful views, and the quietest paths. One morning, I was hiking along a mountain trail at 9 a.m. Mentioning the time here is very important. I had come to a bluff with a gorgeous view, so I sat down there and enjoyed some granola and cold coffee for the next half hour, so by then it would be around 9:30. It was a gorgeous cloudy day, and it was starting to sprinkle. Fine by me. I'd brought a poncho, and there was a gazebo not too far from here for shelter. I looked at my watch, 9:32 a.m. to be exact. I began to stand up then. That's when it happened. It was so strange. I'd felt perfectly healthy that entire morning. But the moment I stood up, I felt lightheaded and dizzy. Now, you know how sometimes you can't help but stare randomly somewhere? Kind of like a yawn for your eyes. Well, that happened to me. I stood there, eye yawning into the cloudy sky, waiting for my faint spell to be over with. As it faded only seconds later, I looked back at my watch. Not sure why I did. Perhaps it was because that watch was new, and I was fond of it at the time. 1:24 p.m. I squinted my eyes and tapped the watch face. I looked at the sky again, struggling to see where the sun was beyond them. Nearly 4 hours had passed in the time it took me to stand up. I took off the watch then, tapping the back where the battery would be. I flipped it back around, making sure I couldn't see any water inside from the light rain. Quickly and nervously, I walked back down the trail. It was a longer walk than simply going ahead towards the gazebo, but I wanted to go back to my car. About an hour later, I had made it back. I threw my backpack inside and got in the driver's seat. I turned it on and looked right at the radio. 2:26 p.m. There was no way both my watch and my radio were wrong at the exact same time. I remember looking at both of them when I started my hike from this exact same spot earlier in the day. I then drove to the nearest ranger station, where two of my colleagues were. Lo and behold, after asking them the time, my car and watch turned out to be correct. Somehow, I had lost 4 hours of my life on that bluff, without any explanation. As I stood leaning over the desk at the station, one of my coworkers, Tyler, asked if I was okay. I felt confident this time around to explain what happened. I think I was just so confused I needed to confide in someone. Tyler nodded as I recounted my tale, then oddly enough he replied, "Yep, I've heard of that before." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I've heard of this happening in Yellowstone twice before you started here. Hikers feeling dizzy, then suddenly they lose 4 hours. And it's always 4 hours, apparently. No idea why." "Do you have any earthly idea what's causing it?" "Not really. I always hoped it was just people fainting and waking up without being aware of it. That being said, are you sure you didn't pass out for 4 hours up on the bluff?" "Absolutely not. I was standing up. I'd have a concussion now after hitting my head on the rocks under me." "Weird. Well, I'll let you know if I hear of a similar story from one of the guests." And that was that. Very strange, very creepy. Where did the time go? I know I didn't faint. I never woke up at any point. I never felt bruising or pain on the back of my head or my back. And I didn't have dirt or pebbles on me, save for my legs and rear, which would have indicated that I had fallen on the ground. Those are my weird memories from Yellowstone. Again, nature is a beautiful thing, but be careful, because when the unexplained happens to you, it comes without warning. Never alone at the laundromat. From Kate N. From the ages of 22 through 25, I used to work at this run-down old laundromat. I was always working alone. I never did see any of the other employees. The owner of the place, we'll call him Rob, was always angry about something. Even on perfect nights or slow nights, when nothing could possibly be out of place, Rob would find something to be angry about. And as I was always the only one there during my shift, all of that anger would be taken out on me. But this story isn't about Rob. He wasn't much more than a stressor, basically. This story is about the laundromat itself. You see, the place, never getting much business, felt very creepy at night. There were odd noises after dark, which always began about half an hour before closing. These noises consisted of footsteps, doors to the machines opening and closing, and someone mumbling to themselves, but I never could tell what they were saying. This quickly led me to believe the place was haunted. One night, I was alone as usual. It was a very slow night. At 11:40, which was about 20 minutes from closing, I was standing at the register. There's a big counter there, and I would work on some hobbies on my laptop whenever there was nothing to do. I hadn't seen another customer for about an hour, and I highly doubted I'd see another one before closing. It was then that I heard a sound that was so sudden and loud, it made me jump. It was this loud slam, like someone had pounded the floor with a metal chair. It echoed throughout the entire room, off the rows of laundry machines. Immediately, my heart pounded and my breathing stopped for a moment. Chills flooded over my whole body. I shut my laptop and ran out in front of the register to get a full look at the lobby. It was empty. No one there, just like it had been for the past hour. I sighed and began to slowly and cautiously walk around each row of laundry machines. There were 5 aisles total. I checked each one, but I didn't find anything out of place. I walked over to the bathrooms, which are on the opposite side of the store to the register. By the way, if you're wondering why we have a register, it's because the owner never bought a change machine. So I had to manually trade dollar bills for coins. Beyond that, my duties were basically to be a babysitter and custodian. Anyway, I made my way over to the bathrooms. And as I did, something above me caught my attention. There was something just barely off enough that I just barely noticed it. But I'm very glad I did. One of the tiles in the ceiling had been moved ever so slightly. There was a black gap, an opening that hadn't been there before, showing the darkness beyond the tiles. My first thought was raccoon or rats, something scurrying about in the ceiling, but that didn't explain the sound. I stopped and looked at it for a moment, wondering what else it could have been. Now, this is why I'm glad I noticed it. If I hadn't stopped there, I would have gone into the bathrooms to check them, and I would have been cornered. Because right as I was standing there, I began to hear rapid, encroaching footsteps coming from one of the nearby aisles of laundry machines. I didn't think then. I just ran, more terrified than I'd ever been. I bolted along the row I was in, which was maybe 1 or 2 rows away from where the footsteps were coming from. I glanced only for a second, long enough to see a shadow of a figure running along an adjacent row in the same direction as me. I was just barely able to make it to the front doors of the building fast enough. Whatever or whoever it was did not catch me. I slammed open the doors and ran over to my car and turned around. No one was there. The glass front windows of the building revealed there was no one inside either. Who had been chasing me? What in the world did I just see and hear? I was so creeped out that I went ahead and locked up, keeping the lights on, and left. As I drove home, I attempted to call my boss, the owner, to tell him what happened. But of course, he wouldn't pick up. He never did, even during daytime hours. You'd think if you owned a place, a business at that, you would be available on the phone a bit more often. By the time I got home and got to bed, I had calmed down. But I knew I was going to be in for it tomorrow evening, when I had to go back in. Rob was the type to wait hours for you to come in on your shift, just so he could give you a piece of his mind. And having left the lights on, and having closed up nothing else, I was about to be in a lot of trouble. But still, I slept like a baby that night. The following day when I went in, Rob confronted me the moment I got through the front doors. For a minute or two, he didn't give me a chance to explain myself. Instead of asking what happened, why the building wasn't properly locked up, he started right away with, "You're lucky you still have a job," and, "I've never seen someone so incompetent as you." I rolled my eyes and waited for him to give me a second. When there was a gap in his yelling, I told him exactly what happened. It was almost closing. I heard something bizarre, and I got chased out of the building. I was too afraid to come back in. At this, Rob looked skeptical. He simply stomped away out of the building and left, tossing back a, "It better be locked up right tonight," before he was gone. I wanted to quit so bad right then, but I needed this job. There were very few job openings in this town. The pay wasn't great, sure, and my boss was awful, but it was literally this or nothing, and I couldn't even afford a week's worth of a gap in my employment. Gotta pay rent. The remainder of the evening I was on edge, dreading the hours as they passed by. The closer we got to midnight, the more anxious I was. I tried to convince myself nothing was going to happen, that what I saw last night was just, well, nothing. Maybe I did hear those noises, but maybe I'd hallucinated the figure I saw. My mind just trying to make sense of the sounds I was hearing. Somehow I managed to convince myself that those footsteps belonged to the animal that had fallen through the roof at that tile, and that was what I heard running through the rows of laundry machines. However, that didn't explain the small gap in the tile. If an animal had fallen through it after pushing it aside, it wouldn't go back and try to push it back into place. No, it would have left a much bigger gap than that. I shook my head at these thoughts. My paranoia was growing. But I did have one thought that comforted me. I'd been working here a while now, and this was the first major occurrence that happened. So, odds are it wasn't going to happen again. I really think I was just coping. At 11:15 that night, we had a customer come in. They used a machine near the back row by the bathrooms. And that machine happened to malfunction. It was a washing machine, and a bunch of water got all over the floor. I had no idea what happened, I'm not a repairman, but it was my duty to clean it up as fast as possible. A spill on the floor was a danger to customers, and a water spill near the other machines could always be a hazard to them. As I went to get the mop, the especially apologetic customer left with a basket full of still wet clothes. I felt bad, it wasn't their fault. I went to work mopping up the spill. It took me about 10 to 15 minutes to get most of it. At the back of my mind, I couldn't help but notice that as I cleaned, I was getting closer and closer to standing under that same ceiling tile, the one that was now perfectly back in place. My mind began to race again. I hoped it was my boss that fixed it. Then again, the gap was so small, I doubted anyone noticed it. So who had put it back in place? I shook off the thought. I did my best to ignore the ceiling as I approached that tile. I even hummed to myself, thinking of a song that I'd heard recently which was especially catchy. Before long, I was right under it, nearly sweating with anxiety. For the next minute or two, nothing happened, and my nervousness was lowering. But then, I felt something. I was looking straight down at the water in the floor when I felt something hit the back of my head. Something light, but definitely there. I could feel the tap 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 of a few pieces of something hitting my hair. Immediately, instinctively, I reached around and felt what it was. I grabbed a piece or two and looked at my hand. They looked like wood shavings, some the color of the ceiling tiles. These pieces were just crumbs in size, and it looked an awful lot like what might fall down if you messed with the ceiling tiles. With a gasp, I looked right up above me. The gap in the tile was back and bigger than before. There was about 10 inches of dark space. The moment I looked up, I saw fingers pulling the tile back into place. Dirty, grimy fingers. I dropped the mop and ran full speed back to the register. No, I didn't leave this time, at least not right away. Instead, I ran right for the phone. There was a landline phone behind the register counter. My cell phone was dead at the time. It had some sort of problem with the battery and wouldn't keep a charge more than about 4 hours. Now, the problem was, there was a wall next to the register. To get a full view of the lobby and the rest of the laundromat, you'd have to walk out of the register counter to take a look. And because the phone was a landline phone, I wouldn't be able to see the lobby while on the phone. As I rounded the register counter, I stopped and looked back. The rows were empty, and there were no strange noises at all. With a deep breath, I practically jumped at the phone and dialed 911. I let them know that I saw someone crawling around in the ceiling of the laundromat, someone that shouldn't be there. They were sending someone over. I felt lucky, because at the time I seriously thought they were going to disbelieve me. They told me to get somewhere safe, especially somewhere away from the building. The moment I hung up the phone, I was about to leave, lock the doors, and head to my car. But the moment that phone hit the receiver, I heard that sound again. The slam. A sound which I now figured was likely that stranger in the ceiling jumping down onto the floor. He was back in the lobby with me. I nearly screamed at the idea and ran for the doors. As I began to open one of the doors, I heard rapid, heavy footsteps echoing through the lobby, quickly gaining on me. I opened the door and ran outside across the parking lot. And to my horror, the door slammed open behind me, and I began to hear heavy footsteps on the concrete. I just managed to make it to my car, open and shut the door and lock it, when those grimy hands to some man began to slap against my car door window. I got a good look at him then. He was wearing an oddly clean black hoodie, with the hood up over his head. That hoodie was so black and clean, I assumed he had stolen it from one of the customers. It was also why I had seen a black blur the night before. He was yelling something nonsensical as he pounded at the glass. Within seconds, the window began to crack. There was a bit of red too, blood, as he was hitting the glass so hard he was busting his skin open. As if by the grace of freaking God, police lights began to strobe around me as a cruiser entered the parking lot, and the officers inside saw what was taking place. That was way faster than I would have ever dreamed a police officer would show up. The moment those lights strobed, the man took off, disappearing in the alley between the building next to ours and the laundromat. I was covered in goosebumps, panting like a dog. An officer with a flashlight was knocking on my door, asking if I was okay. He slowly helped me out of my car. He let me sit in the back of his cruiser to calm down. Eventually, I told them my side of the story and gave a report. Now, you may think I quit, but again, sometimes life just sucks that way. I continued to work at that laundromat for a while, but at the very least, Rob finally grew a freaking conscience, probably after having to talk to the police himself and hearing what happened to me, and he allowed me to take 2 weeks off. So thanks, Rob, at least for that. After this incident, the strange noises at night in that building stopped. For the remainder of my time working there, I didn't experience one more out-of-place, creepy thing. But now that I don't work there these days, I won't ever go back. As for the strange man that was apparently living in the ceiling of the laundromat, who was coming out when he thought no one was around in the dark hours near and after closing, he was never caught. He's out there somewhere, and I wonder if he's trying to take up residence in some other building, haunting and being a danger to some other unlucky night shift employee. Skinwalker of Commerce Avenue. From TheSpecter. This is my first time sharing this experience outside of my inner circle. This happened during the last weekend of July last year. I was working for a local steel mill, and I was on the overnight shift, so that was 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. I was the only laborer on the shift that night, and it was going well. I did my usual rundown of tasks inside, but things started to get weird when I had to go outside. I was wrapping up with the last of my indoor tasks, getting ready to take stuff out to the hopper. I go out as usual, loading up the hopper, and I began to feel like someone was watching me. I began to look around. I soon spotted this lone deer in the tree line. It was watching me. Now, it wasn't too uncommon for the deer to come about, but the thing about this one was it seemed odd, especially since the deer in these parts would be in a group, but this one was all by itself. I tried not to put too much thought into it. I proceeded with finishing up my outdoor task and made my way back in. Things only got weirder after that. There was this heavy presence in the air that night, followed up with a smell of rot and decay, which had certainly not been there before. This smell was horrible. I was nauseated. It also didn't help that I'd had a horrible headache that night. I kept on going, just assuming maybe there was a bear digging through the trash or something. Some time passed, and the smell still lingered. However, it was only getting stronger. At that point, I was on the North Bay by myself. No machines were running that night, and the afternoon crew had left the one hatch opened up about a quarter of the way open. I was sitting down in the chair on the one machine, digging metal chips out of the soles of my boots. I suddenly heard a noise. This grabbed my attention, and I looked over. I didn't see anything, and I just assumed it was an animal. I went back to cleaning my boots. Before long, I heard it again, but this time it was a bit louder. It was a knocking sound coming from that bay hatch door, a full-on knocking. Of course, I go over to investigate. My assumption was that one of my coworkers had been locked outside this entire time, but when I got over there, I didn't see anyone standing there, not even a shadow. But there was still knocking coming from it. This made the hair on my neck stand on end. I wanted to close the hatch door, but something inside me was telling me not to step near it. I found an old broom handle, and thankfully, the operating box for the hatch had big buttons on it for opening and closing the door. So, using the old broom handle, I reached out and I closed the door from a decent distance by pressing one of the buttons, all while standing on the elevated platform. As the hatch began to close, I could feel a sense of relief, but also some dread, because when the door closed, I heard this weird, deep, and annoyed growling sound. This really freaked me out. I slowly stepped away and began checking the side entry doors on the north wall. Thankfully, the afternoon crew had closed those earlier in the day. Even still, the knocking sound would increase and become louder, and before long, it was accompanied by a scratching sound on the bay door, followed up by more grunts. I wrapped up my work on the north end bay, and I made my way back to the south bay. Not wanting to turn my back, I just slowly backed away, keeping my eyes on that darned door. I get to the south side, and I decided to peek out the main entrance door that was next to the punch-in time clock. I slowly made my way out then, and I was shocked by what I saw. Despite looking right at it, I did not believe what I was seeing, so I don't expect anyone else who might be listening or reading this to believe it either. But I swear I saw a floating, disembodied head floating right in front of the North Bay hatch door. It was just floating there, with something orbiting around it. It was just there, almost like it was waiting for me to open the hatch door. I freaked out, running back inside and into the locker room. I went into the bathroom, opened up one of the stalls, and threw up. I was chilled to the nerves and trembling. I'd always struggled with my faith, but I know about the Lord's Prayer. I looked it up on my phone to make sure I got it right, and I began to repeat it to myself, eventually finding myself outright praying. I also ended up messaging my friend that night, telling him of some of the things that took place there. This is quite possibly the weirdest thing I've ever experienced, though it wouldn't end there. My final day at the mill, it was a Saturday in mid-August. I was on the afternoon shift. It was storming that night. The bay door hatch was opened this time around. We would unload trucks as late as 9 p.m. The driver and I were talking afterwards, just talking bullcrap. I signed the paperwork and he was soon on his way. Just as he left, a huge flash of lightning cracked through the sky, and the moment the lightning hit, it lit up the whole area, revealing to me the entirety of the figure that floating head had belonged to. A tall figure with a deer skull head. It stood as tall as the bay hatch door entrance. It wore tattered cloth, and it was just standing there, peering into the door. I stayed inside for the remainder of my shift. There is something on Saddle Road. From Aloha Potato. I grew up in southeast Idaho, in a small farming town. I worked around there until I got a job offer to work for a company in Hawaii as a mechanic. To me, that was the deal of a lifetime. I mean, not many people where I'm from can say that they moved to and worked in Hawaii. So I took the job, and I found out that a couple of friends would be joining me. So off we went to the Aloha state, where the temperature is always warm and the beaches are beautiful. Now, as time went on, my friends began to leave one by one, until I was the last one there. I was about to leave with a fat wad of cash in my pocket when I got another offer from the same company. This time, they would want me to be a driver and deliver products on the Big Island. It sounded simple enough, but the only downside was that the plant I was to be stationed at is in Hilo, and I would need to do a route over on the Kona side, which is on the other side of the island. In reality, it isn't too bad, but it is the longest route that the company has. I would have to wake up at 12 a.m. just to get to the distribution center and do my pre-trip, make sure I have all my products for all the stops, and start heading over before 2 a.m. On average, I would not get back until around 3 p.m. Sometimes the days would be shorter, sometimes longer. It just depended. But to me, it didn't really matter, because the money was great, and I was greedy. If I only knew what would happen to me, I would have just packed up my tools and left. The reason why so many weird things happened on the Big Island to me, compared to any other island I went to, is that it was there where I learned a lot of superstitions of the native Hawaiians. Some are similar to the superstitions we have back at home, like not whistling while the sun is down. Where I'm from, it's supposed to attract skinwalkers and wendigos and the like. For them, as it was told to me, it was disrespectful to the spirits that roamed the islands. I have a lot of paranormal stories from over there in Hawaii, and if this story is interesting to some of you, and you want to hear more, I'd be willing to share. In this particular story, it's one of my scarier encounters while I was over there. It started like any other day. I made my way over to the distribution center, checked my loads, checked my truck for a pre-trip, and headed off over Kona from Hilo. The only downside I had was that the gas station where I usually had my coffee in the morning was closed for remodeling. So as I went up Saddle Road, I was a little groggy, but it wasn't too bad. I mean, it wasn't to the point I was about to fall asleep. I climbed up the mountain up on Saddle Road in my rig. I believe I was listening to a podcast about conspiracy theories at the time. I soon made it to the top of Saddle Road. Once there, I decided to pull over and relieve myself. I'll give you a bit of layout. As you're heading towards Kona on top of the mountain, there is a park. Just a little ways down from the park, there is this military installation where I stopped. I decided to pull over and do my business, and I would readjust so I could go down Saddle Road. I went to the park to do my business, and as I was coming out, I heard what sounded like a coyote yipping just behind me. Now, that may not be a little odd to me, seeing how I grew up in an area where there are tons of coyotes. But the problem was, I don't believe there were any coyotes in Hawaii, let alone any predators of the sort. I've heard rumors that there were wolves up in the northern side of the island, but that was just it. Rumors. I never saw any wolves up there, and I've done quite a few routes up in the northern part of the island. The only predators I've ever seen were the wild pigs that roamed all over the island. But what I just heard was definitely a coyote yipping. So I turned around to see if I could spot any nearby coyotes. But I didn't see any. As I turned around and began walking back to my rig, I heard the coyote yip again. Immediately I spun around, and what I saw shocked me. I saw a silhouette of what I could assume to be a man passing the outhouses where there was little light. He hid behind a tree and peeked out at me. This obviously freaked me out, so I started double timing back to my truck. By the time I got back in, he was still out there, peeking around from behind the tree. I started up the rig and took off. The whole time as I passed the military base, I was wondering to myself, who in the world, or what in the world, was that? My first guess was it was probably a homeless man who wanted to jump me. Then I thought maybe a skinwalker, because it came out after the coyote yipping I heard. In an attempt to calm myself down, I ended up listening to some country music, singing and whistling along as I went down Saddle Road, doing my best not to think about it. Halfway down Saddle Road, as I whistled, I saw something out of the corner of my eye running towards the road. As I looked around to see what it was, what I saw horrified me. I saw this dark humanoid figure running towards the road to the point where he was in front of my truck. I immediately tried to swerve out of the way, but from what seemed to have happened to my perspective, I hit them. But the crazy part was I did not feel or hear a thing. No thuds, no bumps, no screams or yells. Nothing happened. When I was finally able to stop, I got out of my truck to see if I did indeed hit someone. A little ways up the road, I saw the dark silhouette of a man, and it felt as if he was staring at me with so much hatred that I felt it in my soul, even though I couldn't even see if he was looking at me. Then he turned and walked off to the other side of the road and began to cross the lava rocks until I could no longer see him. This event had spooked me enough that I got back in my truck and slowly made my way down Saddle Road until I got to Kona. I pulled into a gas station, bought a pack of cigarettes. That day was the first and only day I ever smoked while on the job. Not 2 weeks after that, I put in my 2 weeks' notice to the company I worked for, ultimately deciding to move back to southeastern Idaho. Writing out this story now still freaks me out. To this very day, I don't know what I saw. Maybe it was one of the Night Marchers, a native Hawaiian spirit. Or maybe it was a Skinwalker. Either way, I hope I never have an experience like that again. But still, it's really good to get it off my chest. Tales from the Break Room is a viewer-submitted podcast featuring allegedly true scary stories that happened on the way to, on the way from, or at work. If you want your story to be narrated on the show, send it to us at eriecast.com/submit. As of April 14th, we're paying 3 cents per word for stories that are approved and make it onto the show. Submission does not guarantee approval or payment. For a limited time only, PayPal only. Tales from the Break Room is an ErieCast Network original podcast hosted by Darkness Prevails. You can follow him on Twitter at Dark Prevails, and you can hear thousands more stories read by him on our other show, Unexplained Encounters. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow and rate Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can also enjoy plenty more horror-themed podcasts at eriecast.com.